Okay. Here I'm starting off with two spheres. So I went ahead and created a sphere I kind of flattened the planes off, just like looking at those references. Then I inserted another sphere that was going to be representing the face. And then I just used the clip curve brush to go ahead and define the jaw, the corners of the jaw and the underside of the jaw. So just cutting off underneath that. And then what I did was I went ahead and positioned and overlapped them a bit so that they fit together a little bit better. One of the first things I noticed, again looking back at my reference, you can look at that SR head, is the corners of the eye sockets, where the eyebrow corner is narrower than the cheekbones. So that kind of overlap of the bottom sphere that's going up, that's wider than the top cranium sphere. So I went ahead and just made sure that that was something I put in before I combined them together. Another thing I did was I went ahead and defined the side to front planes of the side of the jaw face to the front of the jaw face, mouth face, whatever you want to call it. And that's what you're seeing where I'm using Damien Standard to kind of define a line, and then I use hard polish to go ahead and flatten or try to make a more distinct transition shape between those two, the side and the front. When you use hard polish, a lot of times you'll also get the surface will start to kind of become a little bit concave, like it kind of pushes in and you lose volume and then it kind of gets a little weird. So sometimes I'll use clay at a really low value to kind of fill in and flatten it again. So if you're ever hard polishing and you see your mesh just kind of shrinking too much and it has this weird dipping valley shape, then you can just use clay to sort of fill that one out. Okay, now once I've kind of softened the look, right, you notice when I defined the front and the side cheekbones, I kind of felt like they were a little bit too extreme, like that transition, and her face was feeling a little too wide. So you'll see me with the move brush often just kind of shrinking those pieces in, pushing them along. A lot of times, pro hot tip, whatever you want to call that, hot tip. If you hold Alt and click with and drag with the move brush, you move along the normals. So a lot of times you'll see I'm kind of pulling the surface away and towards itself. And when I'm doing that, I'm using the move brush but holding Alt. In the bottom left hand side, you can kind of see my brushes as I'm working. So if you're ever curious as to what brush I'm using at the time. And then eventually what I do is I Dynamesh. So I Dynamesh it and then just kind of smooth out that transition area. And then I quickly Z-remesh it with a really low topology. So that just gives me something that's quick and responsive. We really don't want to be at a stage where we're working with high poly meshes. So really be careful not to have that. Then I keep refining kind of the shape of the cranium, right? So I was kind of start shrinking the back of the cranium. I define kind of where the eye line is, so it's going to tell me more or less where my eye corners sit, and also where the corner of my cheekbone eye socket is. So going from the eyebrow down to the cheekbone, that's also going to tell me a little bit more of where that is. And then you start to see me block in the brow region, so where the eye sockets, top of eye sockets are, and how they transition down to the nose bone. I make that a little bit more prominent when I get to working on the nose. There. Defining a front facing kind of downward plane for the chin, I really just wanted a little bit of a chin distinct plane, right? Because it's very easy for the chin and the jaw to kind of just disappear into each other. So I wanted at least some distinct plane change. You'll see I'm just shifting around. I'll do a lot of back and forth between each kind of area. You'll also notice that I'll be looking at a lot of different perspectives. So, sometimes I'll be looking, a lot of times I'm looking at 3/4, but sometimes I'll look straight down or from underneath. I'm just kind of looking at my reference to see how that's supposed to feel and look. And you'll see some things I'll keep and some things I just start losing and getting rid of. So those areas that I was highlighting earlier, which is, the prominence of the corner of this forehead, right, where that transition from the front planes to the side plane is, the shape of the eye socket, right, and then that cheekbone shape that transitions down to the mouth, jaw area. And then eventually I start going ahead and sculpting in using essentially like clay or clay buildup, and subtract out the eye sockets a bit more so that I can get more clear shape, and then I get that kind of top eye socket area, which transitions from the nose bone to the brows. And then I have another version that I had saved where I had done like a more stylized, simplified version. And then eventually, what I start doing is I start to match this using Spotlight to my character's face, or my reference. So I'm wanting to get kind of like my proportions blocked in here. So once I've gotten like the features in, right, I got like my main head's shape in, I got the brows where they're at, I got the jaw, forehead, and ears in there. So I went ahead and go ahead and line that up as best I can with that reference using Spotlight, and then I just store a camera using this store camera, which is found under draw or document, I think, at the bottom. And so then using that, now it's just kind of pushing around and changing those shapes, figuring out where how long her face is, where her eyes lie, where her eyebrows lie, where her chin lies or jaw lies. So you'll see me just kind of keep refining it. I'll often go back out to 3D view mode. And I'm looking at a lot of reference off screen as well, and taking breaks to kind of see, where, how other people are stylizing characters in the round, right? Because I have a 2D concept, and in some cases, some of you guys aren't even able to see your character from the front, right? Maybe their face is obscured somehow. So I'm often looking at other references, my anatomy references, but also just 3D sculpts of stylized characters, and just kind of seeing what I like and figuring out how to make a character like mine from 3 dimensions, right? How the cheeks kind of are shaped, where the jaw is, how prominent certain bony parts are. And then eventually, I'm still kind of looking back at an earlier version I had done, just because I was happy with it at a certain point. So I did it before I kind of did this exercise. So I was just comparing to that. But at a certain point, I actually kind of end up liking the new one better. So I start comparing it, but then it gets better, and that's kind of something you'll notice as you get more further along with sculpting and modeling and most skills in general. Is the more you do it, the easier it is the second time, and it's usually better the second time. So at this stage, I'm going ahead and dropping in a nose object. So I just start with a cube. I'm just going to go ahead and use the 3D gizmo to place it. Kind of rotate it into position. I'm pulling it over to my references, and I'm looking at my references. I'm kind of going with this. You'll see me searching a lot on my reference board, but I'm trying to get this kind of just cube rectangle shape here for the main nose bone representation. And then what I eventually do is I just go ahead and Z-remesh it at a really, really, really low poly count. And then that way it's just really fast and responsive, and it's just very, very simple. So then I go down to my actual nose references, and you can kind of see how I'm taking those simplified shapes and starting to, I'm just kind of copying that same kind of look. I'll have to also look at some other references and other views, right? So looking at from the side. So these ones are mostly from the front. So I can kind of see how that nose bone transitions down to the muscles that are on the front of the face, and also kind of that combination of the nose bone with the bulb of the nose, where all that cartilage in your nostrils are. Also looking at my character, trying to figure out the tapering, right? So in my character, like there's only so many lines that are being used to represent the character. So there's some things I have to guess at or kind of make up on my own based on the reference, right? But yeah, so and you can see I actually start to like adjust my reference against my model instead of trying to match my model against my reference. So now that I have more features, it's easier for me to kind of like position based on my features, and then get those features, proportions, and distance from them closer to each other based on the reference, and then adjust everything around it. So I like to keep, especially with like, in this case, her nose is very subtle. I could have just sculpted it out, but I frequently like to just have like something that's really prominent, like this nose, or if there's really, really distinct shapes or simplification of certain areas or parts of the face, like you have a character who has like essentially giant rectangles for cheekbones, and it just looks like that from far away. I'll often actually like block those in with primitives, so that I can get that volume and shape and capture that stylized shape really, really well before merging it with the rest of the face. Because sometimes just sculpting it out of a mesh, like a clay ball, just gives you some mushy results. So whenever I can with a stylized character, I like to have separate objects, because that gives me really, really distinct volumes wherever I need them. So I'm just going ahead and continuing to like refine different areas, aligning that nose object with the eye socket, continuing to adjust my proportions. A lot of times you'll see me just making decisions without kind of referencing anything or looking at anything, and that's just from personal preference, right? Like, and experience, right? So I look at a lot of characters. So yeah, you'll see me, kind of make decisions without consulting anything, and that's just based on my experience of what I think looks good and what I've seen other people successfully make a character with. Okay, at this stage, I'm going to go ahead and start blocking in the eye. So I just insert a sphere, bring up my reference, and then to kind of help me, I just went ahead and flood colored the sphere with like a off-white gray kind of color, just so it's a little bit easier to kind of look at. The eyes are very, very challenging, especially the way that they socket into the head. Generally speaking, I try to get the eye to like the center of the eye, or the sphere, to like the horizontal center of the sphere to line up with where the pupil is going to be, or the corner of the eyes are going to be. Depends on your character. Some characters, especially stylized characters, the eyes are challenging because, one, you have to fit them into the skull, and then two, you have to also make sure they have the right shape and they still feel like they're spheres fitted into the socket, right? So I'll pull up a lot of my references and just kind of like look at how they're sitting in there. And then you have to start, once it's kind of like in the right place and you feel like it has the right scale, I start to shift the area of the eye socket, eyelids, nose bone, cheekbone areas around to try to give it enough space so that the eyelids can start working. And at a certain point, you'll see I'm starting to use like Damien Standard, the move brush, and then like clay buildup to kind of carve into the eye socket. You can see I'm working with a really low poly mesh still, right? I just want it to be really quick and responsive. But here I'm just kind of caving in the skull, or that like eye socket, just so I can have enough room to play around with the eyelids, right? The eyelids are going to be the thing that's going to be essentially giving my eye shape look, right? When you think of your character having like a particular shape to their eyes, that's going to be due to the eyelids and the eyelashes. So I'm just giving myself enough space around the eye socket. And then I use this brush that's called, or I called it the worm brush. So this is just a custom brush, but what it is it's essentially it's a insert multi-mesh brush. So if you've never used an insert multi-mesh brush before, what they are is they're essentially brushes that, as you draw, store multiple models in them. There's a version of them called insert multi-mesh curve brushes that lets you draw out a curve, and then it kind of essentially takes one model and extrudes them along a surface and connects them. So it lets you make things like rope, hair, snake. Like if you want to draw out a body of a snake, you can just draw this curve, and it essentially stitches it. This one's just like, I call it my worm brush just because it's a generic kind of like tube shape with tapering on one end and another end. So I'm using these to kind of draw out my eyelids. So you can see I'm just kind of drawing on top of the eyeball. So I'm deleting my subdivision levels, because whenever you use an insert multi-mesh brush, you can't do that with subdivision levels. But what you can see is I kind of draw that curve shape, and then because of my brush, it just draws that shape that follows that curve. And then what you see is I start to go ahead and edit the settings of it, right? So when I first go ahead and make that curve, you can see it. My default for my worm brush is it has this really extreme tapering. So what I do is I go up into the stroke menu and go down to curve modifiers, and then there's this little graph that essentially is changing the size of my curve shape, my worm shape, at different parts of the curve, so starting to ending. And so it has a little bit of a taper, but it has a really extreme taper. So that's why I'm going in there and going into the stroke menu and essentially separating out that or making the ends a little bit bulkier or larger, just so it doesn't taper off into like nothingness, because it's a little too extreme. So editing your curve brushes is really helpful. Then next, what I did was I went ahead and split the models. So you can just you can just go under the I think subtool split, and then split to similar parts. That's just going to separate them out so that I can Z mesh them, do all kinds of crazy stuff to them, without affecting my head. I just having things as separate pieces just makes it really easy for blocking in those major shapes. And then what I do is I use the Z modeler brush. So Z modeler brush is a very complicated brush to get to know. It's very useful when you get comfortable with it, right? Because you can do a lot of modeling actions that you would be used to in Blender or Maya. And then what I do is I essentially take that Z modeler brush, hover over one of my edges, and then right click, and then select crease edge loop partial. What that does is it essentially lets me add a crease to my my mesh, so it creases the edge loop that I select, so that when I use dynamic subdivision levels on this object, so I essentially press 3 on my key, or D on my keyboard, it doesn't have any subdivision levels, but you can see on the top left, dynamic is turned on. So that crease just gives me that kind of shelf shape, right? Because for those eyelids, I want that the outward facing planes, and then the shelf planes, right? The ones that are facing up and down on the eyelids. And then from there, I'm just going ahead and just tweaking how those shapes wrap around the eyeball. So I get these like nice smooth curves. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go back into my main mesh of my head, and then just start kind of tweaking the eye socket region to fit these eyelids and the eyeball better. So there's a lot of back and forth between the eyeballs, the eyelids, and the eye socket region. For me, all as separate objects at this point, because I just want to go ahead and I'm really just trying to capture the shape of the eyes. And you'll see with this part, I actually struggle with this part quite a bit. Doing the eyeballs and the eye socket is super, super, super complex and challenging, right? Because when you're working from 2D, they don't have to think about how it works in 3D. And to get that kind of like slow curvature of the eyeball, right, you usually have to work with a really large eyeball object. If you work with a really small eyeball object, the eyeball tends to feel bulgy, right, because you have a really quick curvature relative to the eye socket. But if you scale up the eyeball object to be really large, you get this kind of flatter eyeball, which usually looks a little bit more appealing for stylized characters. So you can see I'm really using these eyelids wrapping around the eyeball to try to get the eye line shape that my reference has. And I'll just be playing around with them and kind of just really going back and forth of just, adjusting those eyelids. And even at some point I do scale of the eyeballs with the eyelids just to scale them down a bit. But it's a lot of just like, not nitpicky work, but a lot of it's just very kind of meticulous, kind of looking in a lot of different views of matching my reference in terms of the eye line, and then matching how the eyelids feel like they're wrapping around the eyeballs, right? Because that is super important. The eyelids and how they wrap around the eyeballs, I want it to feel very dimensional, and I also want it to feel very physical and plausible. So I'm just going ahead and, continuing to refine where those eyeballs overlap. Again, looking at a lot of references to see how the upper eyelid and lower eyelid meet, where they sit on the skull and on the face. you'll notice with my character, the outer corner of her eye is a little bit higher than the inner corner of her eye, right? So that's like kind of gives it this tiger eye look. You'll hear people say like a tiger eye. And essentially what that is essentially, giving this kind of angled sloped look, which gives it kind of this, I don't know, it's very sly, not sly, but it kind of makes someone look very, I don't know, cool, I guess is the term, as opposed to the opposite where the outer corner is lower, which makes someone look droopy or sad, like me. My eyelids are like that, but it kind of gives someone a sad, droopy look. So this would be the opposite. You'll see at one point I go ahead and scale the eyeball down just because, I'm just trying to work those eyelids so much that, I'm just like, this is ridiculous. There's only so much I can do without actually changing the eyeballs. So I go ahead and change the eyeballs, and where the corner trying to raise the corner of the eye socket to match the corner of my eyelid. And then I'll continue to do that. And, I'm spending a lot of time in the eyeball area, but I'll come back around and you'll see I start smoothing out and cleaning up the jaw, cheekbone, face area a lot. Just smoothing off and sort of losing and finding the elements that I really like. Okay, so at this part, I'm actually going ahead and doing like a multi-translate scale. So if you click on that little multiple checklist icon when you're in the Mold 3D, Mold 3D, 3D Gizmo tool, what I do is I left click the eyeball, the upper eyelid, lower eyelid, so that essentially lets me adjust all three of them at the same time with the Gizmo 3D tool. And then what I do is I center my Gizmo 3D tool, and then with symmetry turned on. And then I go ahead and turn on local symmetry, because scaling is really weird unless you turn on local symmetry if you're using mirroring. And then I just scale them down together, right? So because I have that multi-select button turned on, I want to that helps me, essentially scale all of them at the same time without, having scale the eyeballs and then move and adjust the eyelids, right? So it just saves me a lot of time. And then what I'm doing here is I'm just starting to clean up a little bit more on some of my face shapes. You'll see I like to make copies to kind of see how far we've come, and just seeing like, especially when I get into the nitpicky stage, I'll use that to also save a point in my model where I'm just like making changes to see what's actually working. But yeah, so then I'm going and looking at more complex shapes to the face, and I'm going to start working on the mouth. Right before that, you notice I was using the clay brush to fill in some of the undersides and insides of the eyelid shape. The eye socket, so the top underbrow and then the side of the nose bone. I went ahead and just used clay to kind of fill that in. Then what I did was I went ahead and this part, you can see I undo a couple of things and try sort of some things. You can do this just like everything else, multiple different ways. But what I do is I essentially select part of the mouth. So I just mask it off, and then I press Control W to make it a polygroup. And then eventually what I do is I use group loops, which is found under edge loop, which essentially kind of creates like this edge loop kind of border. It's like a bevel between them. And then what I do is I go ahead and just push that mouth in. So I want to kind of create a cavity or mouth bag. You'll see I do things and then I Control Z them back, but ultimately what I do is I just push that shape backwards. You'll see I start to flatten it because I'm trying to think through, but I don't want to do that because when I start scaling, I notice that I can't, with it flat, I don't have the same curvature as the front of my mouth. So I leave it curved after extruding it in. And then I just scale up a little bit more that inside shape so that I can get behind the upper lip and behind the lower lip. So this is actually a new technique I was trying out that I saw from another video. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll just push that in and then just use like clay buildup and then use Dynamesh to really fix that in there and just carve a hole. But in this case I wanted to try something else where I'm just extruding them in and using polygroups. And then what I did is I used the Z modeler brush, which then I right click on that polygroup by the way, I'm pressing Shift F to see my polygroups. I use a Z modeler brush, and I am going to go ahead and select a polygon on that back face of the mouth, and then I'm going to right click it, and then I'm going to say extrude polygroup all, and then what that lets me do is it lets me push back and extrude my mesh. And so that, if I don't have any subdivision levels, lets me essentially go ahead and extrude and push the mouth backwards. So then the next step from that is I'm using that worm brush again, right? So I'm taking that worm brush, and this part was a little challenging in my opinion. It took a little, playing around with it, right? And you can see I Control Z it back quite a bit. I have to change the size of the brush a lot because it's snapping weird. And I also have to turn off like a, what's it called? Symmetry, right? Because symmetry was also kind of screwing it up a little bit. And then that tapering on the middle I didn't like. So what I did was I went ahead and turned the taper off of one end so that it goes from thin to thick as it gets to the middle of the mouth. So I have this like kind of one-way taper as it goes from small as starting to big at the middle. So I was just changing that in that stroke menu. And then what I did was I just go ahead and with symmetry turned off, go ahead and kind of do one side, overlap the middle. Then I go ahead and split the mouth parts out, so those mouth pieces are now separate. The reason why I do that is now I can just go ahead and mirror it. So I do mirror and weld, turning off local symmetry, because at first I turned off the wrong button. Mirror and weld, so that way I can get the left side to look just like the right side. And then what I'm doing is I'm just using the move brush, and I'm just essentially kind of overlapping that edge of the mouth. So this is one of the problems I noticed with this method I was using of that extrusion, is I got this really, 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 really thin kind of edge for the from the corners of the mouth, right around the edges of the mouth before I put the lips on. So it works okay by once I go ahead and Dynamesh this all together. So it works fine once I go ahead and Dynamesh these lip objects to it, but if I hadn't done it, it did cause me some problems later on where that thickness was just so thin that it was too hard to work with. Okay, in the next part, it gets a little confusing, but essentially what I'm doing is whenever I'm going to Dynamesh all my pieces together, because I want to go ahead and Dynamesh like my nose, my eyelids, and my mouth together, and so essentially all my head together. The only thing that my ears are also included, but I didn't block out the ear shapes like I should have. I do that later in the video. What I like to do is I like to copy and paste my tool, my whole subtool, or my whole tool. So what that does is it just makes a duplicate of it, and then I delete all the pieces inside of that one that I don't need. So I got rid of the eyes, the body, all this other nonsense I didn't need, so that I can go ahead and kind of focus on just the pieces that I want to Dynamesh. So and then ZRemesh. So what I do is then I duplicate my mesh. I go ahead and run Dynamesh so all the pieces are welded together. You'll see I got a lot of like kind of bumpy irregular shapes. So what I should have done was I should have used a higher resolution, and then I just use smooth and clay to kind of start cleaning up these areas and filling in any of these weird gaps and holes. And then what I do is once those are welded together, you can see I've turned on solo mode. So I have my original mesh with all the pieces just merged together but not actually Dynameshed. That's right above this one in this tool stack. But I'm just focusing on trying to get my ZRemesher to look good. This isn't going to be my final topology. It's just so I can kind of work with like a really nice quad mesh, which makes sculpting and all the brushes in ZBrush operate better. My ZRemesher was giving me not great results, right? Especially around the mouth area, right? That's where it had a really hard time. You'll see at some point I use what's called ZRemesher guides. So what ZRemesher guides does is it lets you draw curves on the mesh. And then as you draw those curves on the mesh, when you run ZRemesher, it looks at those curves you drew and tries to make the topology from ZRemesher essentially match those, right? So it tries to force topology to work with the curves you want. So, I'll draw it around really prominent areas like, the corners of the lips, even a ring around the eyes and lips and the brow. But and then what I do is I kind of get into like a bit of a hole with that. So I do get a ZRemesher mesh that works okay. But at a certain point, the corner of the mouth really gives me a lot of trouble. The eyelids are also not great, right? Because I get this like weird, the edge loop doesn't actually follow it. But without having to go into needing to do like hand topology, right? At this stage, I don't want to do that. I'm just going to live with eyelids. It's really the mouth that's really bothering me because I know that's going to work. That's going to be really hard to work with. So I go back to, you can see I undo a lot of stuff, right? I'm playing around with, that's why we have undo history. That's why we also duplicate our mesh so we can always go back. And so you can see I'm really trying to work with that corner of the mouth. And eventually what you see me do is I will draw a curve from the inside all the way out to the outside of the mouth, right? So at a certain point, I go ahead and draw in there. And this is probably one of the longest parts of this video, is just me trying to get ZRemesher to give me good results. And, it's all a matter of, and you can see I start from the inside and draw outwards. And so that kind of helps solve the corner a bit. You can see with some snapping, it kind of gets annoying to like continue a curve. You can see at a certain point, the inside and outside stuff starts to like overlap with each other. So I have to like find like a good working angle. And so I draw like a curve around the lips. I'm going to do it around the eyelids. You can see I'm drawing along the eyelids shelf edge. So it does a pretty good job, but that's an area I'm a little less concerned about. It's really the mouth. So I'm just continuing to draw these curves. They don't all have to connect. You just want like a connecting curve for a very, for one edge loop that you're trying to like draw a defining shape, and you don't want like a stuttering kind of like hyphenated curve, right? But you can see how little I'm kind of putting down. I'm just kind of suggesting like, hey, I really want edge loops that are kind of in this shape or in this direction. So you see down on the mouth it looks fine, but up in the eyes it looks really bad. And then I ran into this weird glitch where it was just ZRemeshing it very strangely. So then what I did was I went ahead and just added a subdivision level to it just to kind of get it to like clear itself or something. Sometimes you might just have to duplicate the mesh. And then I come down to the mouth and I'm like, yeah, that's looking pretty good actually. That's like, I got enough topology down there. And when I subdivide it, it's not too bad. And then what I do is I just project the other model, the one that's visible but I can't see it because I have solo turned on, the one that has all the pieces separated, and then I'm just projecting my current mesh onto that one. So I'm doing Dynamesh to get all the pieces together, ZRemesher so that I can get all the pieces or the whole face working with a good quad topology. And then what I do is I add some subdivision levels so I can get some detail back. And I project it back onto the original mesh that wasn't Dynamesh or ZRemesher, so I can get those clean shapes again. So then what I do is now I need to bring it back into my main tool, right? So you'll see me go over into the main tool, the original tool, where I have all my pieces still. And then what I do is I go ahead and I put all of my old pieces, all those little pieces that I used to make this head, into a folder, and I call them head pieces. And then what I do is I go ahead and continue just to work on my welded together mesh head, right? That is just, I do want those as backup, right? You can save them in different files or export them if you really want to. But I just wanted to go ahead and work on my this mesh where it's all welded together. And then I hide the head pieces. And then what I do is I go ahead and use this trick that's essentially masked by topology. So whenever you see me use the 3D Gizmo tool, right, like the move, scale, rotate tool, if you hold control while you're using that tool and drag on the mesh, you can mask in a particular direction based on the topology. And so I do that from the corner of the mouth. I switch over to the move tool, not move brush, the move tool. And then I'm going to go ahead and hold control and drag in a particular direction, and so that's going to like mask off the bottom of the jaw from the corner of the mouth. And then what I do is press Control W, and then what that does is everything that's masked off becomes a new polygroup. And with polygroups, what's nice about that is it essentially lets me use Control Shift, right? Control Shift and ZBrush is selection or view modifier keys. So it essentially controls the viewing of your model and turning on the viewing brushes or selection brushes. And then what I do is if I Control Shift and click on a particular polygroup, what happens is that polygroup becomes isolated visually, like it hides or the part of the mesh that I don't want to look at, right? And so whenever you see half the mesh disappear, that's what's happening is I'm just pressing Control Shift, clicking on that part, it disappears. And then I'll usually throw on a mask by just holding Control and tapping on the canvas. And then what I do is I this is really hard to describe, but it's becomes second nature once you get practice on it. You Control Shift drag on the canvas to bring everything back. And so when you do that, you should see essentially the part that I'd isolated masked off, and the part that was hidden is shown again but not masked. So that lets me control the lips really easily. Essentially, I did all that just so I can isolate and control the upper lip versus the lower lip. So you don't have to do any of that stage. If that workflow is really, really confusing, maybe I recommend you look up a different way to do it, right? Because that's just how I like to work. I've definitely done it before where I've just sculpted the lips on that mouth area and then made the mouth region by just carving in, but I still have to do that Z-remesher reprojection workflow, and I still do that kind of masking one side of the mesh to the other. The reason why we actually make an inside of the mouth is twofold. One is if I did want to do expressions, right? Like let's say I want to sculpt some expressions, then I can actually open her mouth up. So if I wanted to like stick out her tongue or smile with teeth, now I have that option. And then two, it also makes that separation between the upper lip and lower lip a little bit more believable, right? So you can kind of really see the distinct shapes between the upper lip and the lower lip, and they're casting shadow, and they're not like you're not fighting against the model with a sculpt where I have to keep carving in and carving in and carving in to try to make it look like they're not physically connected, because that's usually what happens if you do that. And so then what I do is I'm starting to kind of isolate the different lips, right? So you'll see me start to separate them into different views. So I'm just looking at one and the other, and then I'm kind of sculpting them based off of my lip reference, right? Like I look at those lip anatomy references, and I'm trying to get like the shapes that I'm seeing from my reference for both the upper lip and lower lip. The lower lip, I think, tends to be the harder one to kind of get. One, because it tends to, both of the lips, the pink part, or what we think of as pink part, actually kind of the ends of them, the edges of them, go inside the mouth, right? Like they go behind the corner of the mouth, right? So that can be a little tricky, because you always think like that corner of the mouth is where the lip line of your lips are, right? Like the boundary or border is, but that's not. The thing that we think of as like our mouth opening, right? Like the corners of our mouth is really more of like our cheek kind of wrapping around in that area. And so what you'll see a lot of times, and you can see this is probably one of the grossest parts of my sculpting, right? This is the part where it actually didn't slow me down too much. Like in the past, I would have been very disheartened by this, but I knew that, it just is going to look bad. And as long as I'm studying my references and I'm not afraid to like clean up and restart stuff, you'll see that I just keep trucking on, and it didn't stop me. I just kept going. And so I'm just looking at that top lip and bottom lip, and even when like at this stage I'm like, it just doesn't look good. I don't know what's going on. I just need to look at reference, right? So you'll see me do a lot of different things where I'm playing around. All the little specifics aren't super important. You see, I'm like, I'll start inspecting like the inside of the mouth bag and stuff like that. Don't worry about it too much, but for the most part, I'm just kind of figuring out that corner of the mouth and those lips. So at a certain point, I kind of like pull the corner of the mouth and inside of the mouth backwards, just to give the lips like a little bit more volume. Because I just get really, really frustrated with the corners of the mouth. They're a hard part, right? Because it's very easy for the corners of the mouth just to feel like they are pulled forward instead of kind of going back into the mouth. So what I do, one of the things I do is I mask off the corner, right? Just using I just mask that really small corner area, and then I just soften that mask, right? I soften it by just holding control and tapping on the mesh to feather it, and then I go ahead and just push it back and I move it back into space, which just naturally gives me this feeling that the lips are wrapping inside the mouth, and then the corners of the mouth should feel like they're kind of bulging forward and overlapping. Okay. And then all I'm doing further is I'm just refining kind of how those lips fit together, right? The one thing that's nice about this workflow that I did was it really isolated those as objects, and like technique wise, right, it was really easy to control. The downside is that in my opinion it's easier to sculpt those from the surface instead of like taking this a modeled approach, right? Like actually like using a clay build up to kind of build up that area, carving with the Damien standard and standard brush and all that stuff. So, and then I keep playing with it, and later on you'll see I come back to the mouth to just clean it up. Then the next thing I do is I felt like the jaw and the corners of the mouth were kind of like the areas where I'm not super feeling happy about it. I mean, the mouth itself felt really weird, but I'm just kind of like, I felt like I brought the mouth in too much, and then her jaw was a little too ill-defined. And you'll see at a certain point, like I really kind of soften up and make her jaw a little daintier. Here you can see I'm kind of, again, just adjusting the lips, making sure they sit comfortably. Really subtle areas that are hard to kind of get is the area that is essentially goes from your nostril down and around the corners of your mouth, right? That's like kind of like its own island area. And so, I want it to feel a little bit more distinct in that area. So what I do is I'll like be pushing and playing with that kind of mustachy area, and using like my clay brush and hard polish brush just to kind of like try to fix that area up. It's another area I struggle with a lot of times when I'm working. So you'll see I use clay buildup to push it in a little bit to make it just a little bit more distinct from the cheek. So you get that kind of, it's called the nasal labial fold. It goes from the corner of your nose down around your mouth to your chin. And then I use the clay buildup brush. You'll notice with my clay buildup brush, I just turned off my alpha on it, and I'm just like kind of adding a little bit more volume to the corner of the mouth. Then eventually what I do is I start pushing a lot of the mouth and jaw back in space, right? Back towards the neck. Just like, again, trying to like get the upper lip and the nose to be the most forward parts. And since it's a feminine character, I want her jaw, her chin to be subtler, so I pull her chin and jaw back a little bit. And then I'm also looking from the front to try to match the size and shape of her jaw and cheekbones and mouth and nose. So I'll just continue to go there. Then what I do is I try to make like a more distinct shape change transition from the plane underneath the lower lip and then where the chin actually starts. So the chin is that upward facing part. So I just use Damien standard at that part, as well as when I define the lip line. I'm just using Damien standard to help kind of just draw those shapes and make them a little bit more prominent. Almost all my brushes I'm using a like low Z intensity, so that I build it up kind of slowly instead of really quickly. Cool. And then now it's time to, I've noticed like my nose was left alone for way too long. So then what I do is I go ahead and essentially mask out the nostrils, right? So looking at some reference, I had more reference. Again, I kind of went a lot of stuff off my head, but I needed more reference to see like what the nostrils would be shaped like down there. Oh, and as you can see, I kind of accidentally sculpted something at some point. And so then what I did was I just masked these off, and then I pushed that part up. I didn't do, kind of like the mouth, but I didn't do the whole polygrouping thing. I just inverted my mask and then pushed into the mesh, which turned out to be a lot easier. And, just double checking against my reference, just kind of where those nostrils lie. So you'll see I just invert my mask, and then I just push up into the nose. There we go. push back a little bit. You see that the topology there is really, really bad, and it's hard to work with. So what I end up doing is I need to Z-remesh it again. But first I'm just going to go ahead and like try to soften and add some volume in that area, so Z-remesher has something to work with. So you can see I'm just kind of smoothing that up. I actually added a subdivision level just so I had a little bit more topology to work with. And then I go ahead and get my clay buildup. I put its alpha back on just to kind of, I got like a little weird spot where, you know, the topology completely collapsed, because I really want the distinction of the nostrils, right? That thickness of the wall. I could smooth it, but I knew from smoothing it that it would just collapse because of the low topology. Then I also was using, while I was there, just like the clay buildup to like make some distinction on the side of the nostrils, or I sometimes call them the wings of the nostril. You'll see that I'm really trying to just like, I want this nose to feel very distinct from the face, right? I don't want it to have this like soft kind of transition. So the nostrils and the bottom of the nose, I'm making it very like instant plane change as it gets to the mouth region. Also, I'm like trying to make the inside of the mouth or nostrils a little bit more deep and pronounced, especially pronounced or defined away from my nostril edges. And then I'll go back out and I'm like, oh, that's looking pretty good. So now what I need to do is I need a Z-remesher because I don't have good topology around there. It's a lot of stretched topology. So I just ran Z-remesher. Again, I cloned my my mesh, duplicated it, so I can Z-remesh it and then get all my detail, or reproject my detail from my original mesh. So you can see both of them are visible right now, which confuses me at first because I'm like, when is Z-remesher going to work? But it actually had worked. They're just showing both of them at the same time. So I'm like, oh, duh. So I turn on solo, and so I'm looking at it, just double checking. I'm like, that looks good enough. And then I add some subdivision levels, and then I just reproject this subdivided mesh back onto my high-res one. And then I'll often check back on my high-res one and be like, okay, did I get all the details back? Yes. So then what I do is, now it's Z-remeshed, I go back in and insert that back into layer stack and delete the original one before I had put the nostrils in. And now you can see that this nostril area is going to respond better just because I have topology that supports it now through Z-remesher. All right, so it's just going to make it a lot easier for me to actually get some stuff done. Cool. And then in here, I'm just continuing to define the nostrils. Same thing with the lips. I get a little bit too anatomical with some things that I don't really like. So I'll pull back on a lot of that stuff. And then what you see is I use Damien Standard to kind of carve in that like fold over of the sides of the nostrils where it touches the cheek. So I do build out that area. That's like one area I like to really have kind of be distinct. And then I use Trim Dynamic to remove the corners and edges on my nose, right? Because I don't want my character to actually have a square nose. I want it to be softer, right? So I actually end up using Trim Dynamic to knock those back a little bit. And then what I also do is I use a little bit of clay or clay buildup to kind of get this sweeping transition from the hill of the bridge of the nose down to the cheek. So I'll use that to just kind of, if you see me kind of scrub over an area and it just looks like the area is getting softer, I'm either smoothing it or using clay to kind of make it gentler. And then I'm just adding more volume and shape to the nose, trying to get away from that cube part. I wanted a little bit more of a distinct change from the what do you call it, the bulb of the nose where the cartilage and the nostrils are, and the nose bone. So I'm kind of making a slightly more distinct transition between them. Again, my character, I'm keeping her pretty soft and feminine, so I'm being careful of where I have hard and planar shapes, and trying to keep those pretty intentional. I'll I can see at some point I go to the side and I'm trying to match and look at a lot of references of how a character looks from the side. You'll see me also Control Z back and forth a lot. This is the stage of my character where I'm going to be doing a lot of Control Z comparing, right? Just going back and forth, just to be like, is that an improvement or is that not an improvement? Eventually I use another tool but we'll wait till we get there, of using morph targets. And then you can see right here what I'm doing is I'm kind of defining that that I wanted a little bit more of a distinct edge difference between the bottom of the nose and the top of the nose. That's just a stylization choice that I chose. And then I'm just, moving on to the rest of the face. Whoop. And I'm just kind of cleaning it up. I'm looking at the volumes. There's some areas where it feels like it goes a little too concave, especially in the eye socket area. So I just kind of add a little bit more volume to those areas a lot of times. And of course I go back to my reference. So I look at my reference again and I'm like, oh, her eyes still don't feel quite right. So I make a couple adjustments. So first thing I do is, before I go to the eyes, I'm kind of, I start looking at it again in 3D, and I'm like noticing that the cheek jaw area just feels a little too wobbly, and it's kind of gross. Later on, I adjust the eye socket. I reduce the jaw, like the corner of the jaw, quite a bit. At a certain point, you can see I really play around a lot with the cheeks and jaw. And then at this point, what I'm doing is I'm getting this really, really, really soft mask around the eyes at a low subdivision level. And then what I do is I use that multi-selection again, right? So I use the multi-selection, selecting the... actually, in this case, I don't know if I do. Let's see. Okay, in this case, I don't. I just softly select the eyes around the eyelids and eye socket, so I have a nice fall off. And I'm just trying to adjust them again around the eyeballs. And then I go ahead and scale the eyeballs separately. And, I'll do a lot of back and forth. Again, every part of the body in a stylized character takes forever. The face is probably, besides the hands, like one of the hardest, and the time you noodle a lot. But it takes a lot of like cross-referencing, right? I'm like looking at stylized characters, I'm looking at my anatomy reference, and I'm really trying to get a good understanding of what looks good and what looks wrong. Trust your eye. If you feel like something doesn't look right or doesn't look good, chances are there's something wrong with it. We get to this stage, things are so subtle that it's sometimes really hard to tell, right? Like you can, for me, that cheek jaw area gets really, really smooth, and so it gets really hard to understand how that works. So essentially what I'm going to be like looking at it, just spinning around my model a lot. If you need to take a break, walk away from your computer, come back, and then look at it with fresh eyes, and hopefully that'll help you see it. Next step I'm using this topology brush. So the topology brush, you can see it's a little finicky, but essentially what I do is I draw out the top and bottom of my eyebrows. I switched to the eyeball object, by the way. And then what you can do is you can draw intersecting curves, and you'll see what it does is it creates polygons as you complete four sides. Doing these kinds of curve drawings are kind of hard, right? So you'll notice in the middle, I have to do a lot of cleanup and playing around with it. If you ever need to delete a part of a curve, you hold Alt and drag over that part, and it essentially deletes it. So when you see me drag over a part of the curve, it essentially deletes that part of the curve up to one of those green intersection points. And those green intersection points are just where the curves intersect, right? Essentially that's defining a vertice to ZBrush. You can do this method, you don't have to do this method. But anyways, once I'm done with that, I just tap on the mesh and it generates like this kind of extruded piece of geometry. Then I separate it. So then I separate that mesh out. I go ahead and mirror and weld with local symmetry turned off. And then what I do is I fill it with a dark color. So I'll give it like a dark gray color. So I'll go here, and then that way, I can see these eyebrows clearly. And then what I do is I go ahead and uncrease it, right? Because I was getting those really sharp edges. And these aren't going to be my final objects. These are just kind of blocking in the 3D shaping of where my eyebrows are going to be. And so I'm just following, kind of, again, looking at reference, that kind of basic shape of my eyebrows, right? So my eyebrows should have this kind of like two-part shape to it. You have main body, which goes from the middle of your eyebrow or your head to the corner of the eye socket. And then you have this like transition. You can see that angle. It's almost like, a pair of glasses, the sides of the glasses, right? You have the main arm, and then you have that little part that bends down around your ear. It's kind of like shaped like that. And then I get that to wrap around the the eyebrow socket region. And then I'm just continuing to clean up and fill in areas around my eye. You'll see I come back and play around with where the eyebrows sit at one point. For the most part, your eyebrow hair object and then your eye socket doesn't always correlate, right? Like for the most part, they kind of show up in the same location, but you could obviously stylize your eyebrows or give a different shape, right? If you're like penciling them or shaving them or trimming them. But for the most part, if you're doing a stylized character, and most characters, you can just have that it should kind of match the eye socket shape a bit. Cool. So then I come over to the side and I'm like trying to reduce a lot of the shapes. At this point, what I'm doing is I am like kind of bringing her jaw and her cranium forward a bit. And so I bring her jaw closer to the front of her face just because it felt like her face was really deep for my character. Playing with the positioning of the ears. Not quite sure. I can't remember where I start blocking in the ears, but we'll cover that a different time. But you can see I think actually this is the part where I do it, right? So I do the same thing with that I did on the mouth and the eyelids is I just go ahead and use my worm brush to as effectively, and I bring that tapering on both ends back by going to the stroke menu. And so I'm just essentially kind of getting that outer ring shape, right? Right. If you look at the breakdown of the ear, you have this like outer coil kind of shape going on. And I also look at other stylized characters a lot of times. Like I'll look at how other people simplify the ear because I don't want it to be like humanoid or too realistic. I get this outer piece, as eventually what I would do is I would dynamesh it down or merge it. You could use a unioning your mesh instead of dynameshing. And then I get that kind of little corner, like the little raised part that is, right there. I wish I could I should have pulled the references up, but a lot of this is stuff I'm looking off camera for, right? So you can see I kind of combine those all together. Here we go. So I'm kind of looking in here. I'd flip this over so you can see it. See, I kind of combine that purple part with that red part in that Anatomy for Sculptors reference, just to stylize it. And then I'm going to essentially combine it together with the earlobe, which is that green part. And at a certain point, I feel like this gets a little too anatomical, surprisingly. Like the silhouette, right? It started out as like a really simple disc shape, and then at some point it becomes a little too more complex and feels like that question mark shape that ears tend to have. You see here, I'm pushing in the disc of the ear on my main mesh, right? Because I'm eventually going to merge those together. So I'm just kind of giving a little bit of a dish, right? So ears kind of push in like a bowl. Continuing to just like refine this. Okay, at this part, I go ahead and use my worm brush to draw the inner, that yellow part. If you look at that reference, there's like that yellow kind of Y shape that's in there. So I go ahead and just drop that in and then just drag it around until it's in a shape I like. So again, I'm keeping it still pretty simplified, stylized, and I'm kind of playing around with it, and just seeing what I like and what I don't like. And at a certain point, I'm not going to go too much in detail here because I think this is very subjective and not worth spending a lot of time talking about. But I've just figured out a way I wanted to abstract it based off of a reference I had found of another stylized character, and I would just kind of exploring and trying myself. One thing you'll see is I'm trying to like get this kind of indentation in there. That's kind of hard because it's two meshes overlapping. So I actually solo it so I can hide the main head mesh. So whenever you have another mesh that's visible, it can sometimes block your brush marks, right? Even though I wasn't affecting the main head object, it was still blocking my brush from reaching the insides. So I get that put in, and I told myself, I'm like, okay, I am not going to be messing with that. For now, I'm just going to ignore the ear. One thing you notice me doing here right after the ear is I'm switching between morph targets. So I did that. I set up the morph target earlier without talking about it, but the morph target is essentially going to be, you can find it underneath a subtool, or I have it up there called store MT or switch next to it. And so what they do is storing a morph target saves your mesh in its current position, right? Like all the vertices, on this mesh are saved in a certain position. And then I can continue to sculpt, right? Like I keep working, I move things around. And then if after making a bunch of changes, I want to go back and see if I like those changes, and I'll do that a lot more frequently now. I'll go back and forth. So you can see I'm morphing back and forth to be like, are those good changes or those bad changes? And so sometimes I'll, keep the new one, or sometimes I'll go back and get the original morph target. It's like kind of using undo history, but it instead of control Zing 30 times and control shift Zing 30 times to go back and forward, it essentially lets you kind of save like one state of your mesh, and then keep sculpting and save another state of your mesh wherever you switch it. And then once if I make a commitment, I'm like, oh yeah, this change is better. Oh no, this original is better. I'll go ahead and switch that one, delete the morph target, which is next to the store morph target button, and then store a new one, so that I'll just keep working, and then again go back at some point and be like, oh, I don't know if I like those changes, and then use that morph target to go back to where I had last stored it. So it's kind of like saving a checkpoint. Or saving a version of your file, but just on the mesh level. And here, add a little bit more volume. Looking back at my eye references, that side of the eyebrow, the underside, it has a little bit more volume to it. So I use my clay clay buildup brush and clay brush to just kind of like fill that area in, just give it more volume. And then I do the same thing a little bit on the side of the nose bone eye socket transition from the nose to the eye socket area. And I just play around with like kind of shaping that, making it a little bit more prominence, playing with where the transition starts and stops, and stuff like that. So you'll notice for a lot of this, I am kind of like pulling like this is like, kind of rubber, right? Like I'm just kind of squishing and squashing things, and pulling them around just to kind of make them feel good, and also think about what my character should look like in 3D. And then a couple of times you'll see me redefine some parts of my model, right? Like I'll exaggerate the planes again really subtly by using like Damien Standard or hard polish, and just kind of like trying to make those areas a little bit more distinct, right? Because as you soften things up, it's really easy to lose those initial kind of planes, those really large scale planes. And while we do want it to be subtle, we do want that kind of realistic structure of the head, or believable volume and structure of the head. And then another thing I'm doing here is you can see I'm like adding volume and thickness and roundness using the clay brush on the nose bone area. Right? Because especially since I started off with the nose bone and the nose being so flat, right? So rectangular, it didn't have like any roundness. So it started to kind of feel like it didn't have any volume. So then I just went ahead and just used clay to fill it back in. And then just going back to different areas and redefining those shapes and volumes. Okay, at this point, I go ahead and lock in the, just like I did with the lips and mouth and eyebrows, I'm using, in this case, my worm brush to go ahead and draw in an eyelash objects. So again, I'm going to make them black, a lot like the eyebrows were. And I'm just kind of making them where they are on my, based on my reference, and you'll see me bring them back and forth quite a bit. Separate them out, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and kind of look at where they are, where they're thicker and thinner. You can see on the insides it's a lot thinner. So I'm just going to go ahead and smooth that out. You can see it smooths really, really quickly because I'm using... I play around with it a little bit where I'm just like, can I just like shrink it all overall because it's a little too thick? So I tried using the inflate deformer. So the inflate deformer, which is found under the deformations tab, essentially just shrinks everything in your mesh at the same time, like using the inflate brush. So I used it in the negative way. So I negative inflation. So that just kind of shrinks it down. And then I'm just using my soft brush and just gradually kind of brushing over that with my tablet. And then just kind of getting like this taper from the insides of the eyelid, right? So like towards the inner corners of the eye, like towards the nose, it's a lot thinner. And then towards the outer part, the eyelashes get thicker. Based on my reference. And so I'll just do a lot of cleaning and polishing. This part, a lot of times what I'll do is, I would remodel these, just like we'll block in the hair later. But a lot of times I just remodel this stuff, right? It's going to be easier sometimes just to go ahead and start from a simpler shape instead of mushing around something that is hard to work with. And yep, just kind of continuing to play around with it. Depending on your character, just like how makeup works on people's faces, right? Like it can really change the appearance of like certain features. So the eyes and how your eyes look are on a stylized characters are very reliant on that balance of your iris, your eye whites, your eye line or shape, right? Eyeliner, right? Like where the edges of your eye are defined in the art. And sometimes that also includes creating eyelash objects where they're kind of exaggerated. Some characters don't need them. Sometimes you can get away with just like coloring the edges of the eyelids black, as if you were putting some eyeliner on. But yeah, you'll see I don't really add in the pupils and irises. That's another thing I should have done by now. And so, what I would do is I would take my eyeball object and then just like essentially replace it or edit the existing eyeball to get the iris pupil shape in there. And that's another part of that back and forth, is just making sure the iris is sitting very naturally within the eye whites and how the iris and the pupil relate to the edges of the eyes. But I don't go over that here. Hopefully I can go over that at a different time. And like I said, I would do that a lot earlier in the process, but I felt comfortable enough with my own experiences that I didn't think it would be super necessary for me. All right, at this stage, I'm going to go ahead and put on some poly painting. Take as long as you want to put the poly painting on. Don't do it too early, just because you want to get those shapes and forms figured out, and color and value on the face can trick you, right? It can make you think that like the cheek has a plane when it doesn't, right? Again, like makeup, you can do like contouring to change like the structure, visual optical structure of your face to be something different. So then what I do is I go ahead and fill my character's face in with just like kind of like that color I've been using for a while, right? I had like this peachy, fleshy color. And then what I do is I just flooded it and then used standard brush, turned off the Z add, and turned on RGB. And so that turns off the Z add, which is a sculpting effect of the brush. And then I go ahead and turn on the RGB, set it to like 20%, so I can paint color. So it's just whatever color I have on my down there, right? I'm just painting it in. So I start with like this pretty neutral reddish, purplish. Like compared to the skin, it's a little bit more in the red tinted tone, closer to the cooler blues and purples. Still in the red area. You would think of it more like shared with peach compared to the or pink compared to orange. So it's closer on that end of the spectrum. And then I clean up that lip line a bit. I usually make the upper lip darker and the lower lip a little bit lighter, just to, often is the case. Um, uh, and there is a little bit of variety to it, but for the most part, I keep it pretty simple. And then what I do is I go ahead and use my skin color back over it again. So I just like fill it again with use my default skin color just to kind of wash away a little bit of the pinkness, right? Because it was a little too saturated. Then I did the cheek blush. It's usually like the only other thing I do in this case. So I got like a little bit of an orange red. In this case, I went to orange. Then I pushed back towards red. Again, just using a big brush and just kind of softly, gently kind of, working my way, just scrubbing that area with a low Z intensity. So you can see that I get that blush pretty quickly. And then again, just like with the lips, to knock it back a bit, I just switch back to my default skin color, and then I just kind of dial it back a little bit more, just because you can see it gets a little too rosy and a little too saturated. And I think I even end up a little too rosy and saturated. Subtlety is nice. And later on, I'm probably going to just retexture this anyways. So I'm going to be painting this color map, but this is helping me kind of get a closer impression of what my character might look like in the end. Another thing I sometimes do is I'll sometimes put like eyeshadow values on there too, and sometimes I'll also paint in on the eyeline, like a black eyeliner, but that takes some precision and control, and I don't think that's something we really want to focus on right here. Yeah, and then sometimes I just put like a little value on the nose, but that's, it's totally your call. It's not always the case. And again, this part, we don't want to go crazy with the poly paint. We just want it to be, just help us bring a little dimension and life to our character. So you can see I'm just turning it off and on for previewing purposes. Okay, for the last step, I'm going ahead and just blocking out the hair. I'll sculpt it more in detail later using different brushes, but for the most part, I just want to kind of get the volume and major shape changes. So I start with just insert a sphere. I kind of place it like almost like a little afro. Just start with. You see I have to realign the character's head just because this was a different session that had started up, and I lost my reference, so no worries. And so, yeah, I gave it a darker color because I knew her hair was going to be black, so I went ahead and set that up. Cool. So the first thing I do is I kind of like look at where her hairline is, like where her bangs are. Even though her hair is asymmetrical, I started out as symmetrical as I feel like I can get away with, right? I'm looking at where her hairline starts and stops. So that's what I'm doing first. And then I'm also kind of giving her bang objects and trying to figure out like how they cover her face. And then eventually what I do is I start to just push and pull on pieces to get it to match the volume of the head. This is something that I'm going to like be looking at a lot of reference for. This isn't like anatomy, so and this isn't the week we're doing hair necessarily. So I'm just trying to get the hair to kind of feel accurate to what I see in real life. So this case, like on the top of her head, the hair kind of not shrink wraps, but it's like closer to the shape of her actual skull. And then down below when it starts hanging, then it's like its own thing, right? Like almost like a piece of clothing. So then, you can see I go ahead and match it against the reference. And then I'm just going to drag to match the silhouette. So I'm, using a little, turning the opacity down. And then I'm just, using that grab brush on the corners and just kind of dragging it down to where I think it is. It's not going to work very well in the other views, but it just gives me something to work from at the beginning. Okay. So you can see it's just flat and planar. So I just go ahead and add some volume to that and change how I feel like it should be shaped. In general, I think I feel like it should be shaped like a bell, sort of like a bell shape. As I refine this character's hair, I'll just keep doing that, just kind of keeping that shape in mind. And then I quickly Dynamesh it. I turn on polish on Dynamesh, which just simplifies the shape a lot and just kind of gives you a little bit of that like abstract curvature. I'm going ahead and separating her front and side hair from her face. And so I'm going ahead and getting a little bit more definition in there. And then you'll see I carve out the parts that are actually intersecting her head over there a little bit, just so we can feel like there's a distinct kind of edge or turning on the front of the hair. from the back. And then I just Dynamesh it every once in a while. And so I'll do that for a while, and then here we're doing something new, right? Where I'm kind of want these really distinct shapes, right? Like it's harder to sculpt them out. I could just sculpt them out, but I just wanted to go ahead and use an insert multi-mesh curve brush. So I'm doing a curve brush again. In this case, I'm just using one of the pre-existing curve brushes, which is called Curve Snap Strap. So it's going to essentially draw this like kind of polygonal tube shape, very rectilinear. And I'm just kind of drawing it sort of where I think in the shapes that I would want for kind of having this like separate hair strand grouping, and trying to follow that. You'll see the curve strap snap doesn't behave the way I want it to, so I go into the stroke, go to curve, and turn on snap start, or lock start, lock start. And then I played around with elastic, and I was like, oh, I don't like elastic. Let's keep it bend end. And so I do that, right? So the start stays in place, and then everything else just kind of flows around it. If you don't like the end kind of moving as well as I move the other parts of the curve, then you can turn on lock end too. But you'll see, since I'm using the snap brush, it's by default just snapping to other geometry. And then when I'm done with it, I just tap on the mesh to get rid of the curve. And then I go ahead and I'll move it around and position it. And then I'll do the same thing on the right-hand side, right? Like I'm going to draw like 2 more pieces, and then just eventually I'll separate them out. Separate them out so I can play with them separate from the main mass of the hair. And then what I can do later is I can just Dynamesh them together. And again, this is just like a proxy asset, right? Like we're just trying to play with the volumes of the hair and figuring out the mass and how it relates to the head. We're in a very early, stage for hair and costume, but it's important for understanding how the face stuff works.